Hey fearsome friends, I'm so happy to be back with you reading these stories. I shall be posting 3 times a week and doing live streams maybe twice a month. I've also simplified my Patreon and YouTube membership, so depending on which platform you prefer, for $1.99 you can get early access to all my videos and free Ep.3 downloads of them. All links are in the description below, and I just want to thank you all for your support and sticking with me. Now, on to the fun stuff. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I'm a 25-year-old female from England, so I've never actually met this person. It started around 5 months ago, and at first it was all quite pleasant, but as time went on it slowly became creepy. It was around November-October time, when one day I noticed that one of the wing mirrors on my car had been pushed inwards. I live with my parents and park a street away from the house, so I have a short walk to and from my car because they park their cars on the driveway. I asked my mother if it had been her that had pushed in the mirror, as it was a thoughtful thing to do, but she said no, and so did my father. Whoever it was, I thought, was a kind and thoughtful person. There's a lot of older people that live in the area who always say good morning and are friendly, so I assumed it was one of them. This continued for months and only recently stopped as I was parking in a different side street. I asked a couple of the older people on the street, but they said it hadn't been them either. At this point, all I wanted to do was say thank you. But regardless, I continued going to work and didn't notice anything else. That is until the winter weather got worse. December 2023, and the weirdness continued. The frost kicked in and it snowed on occasion, and as I set off from work at 7 a.m, it was extremely icy that time in the morning, so I would need to de-ice my car. However, one morning I remember I was running late for work. It was 7:15 a.m. and I still hadn't de-iced my car. So rushing to get to my car, once there I see it had already been done. I was very confused, a little happy, but also a bit shaken. It was a strange feeling. Again I asked my parents and anyone around on that side street if it had been them, but it was none of them. My mum laughed and said, "You might have a secret admirer." The de-icing of my car happened a few more times on very icy mornings, so from January onwards I decided to start parking somewhere else, and it was starting to really creep me out. By the end of January, beginning of February 2024, I approached my car one morning to see what I could only describe as some homemade food left on top of the car. I didn't eat any of it and ended up throwing it away once I got to work, but I felt that this situation was getting beyond strange. Around the same time, the first note had been left. It was written in what I could only describe as doctor's handwriting, and it basically asked if I had enjoyed being treated like, and I quote, "the princess I deserved to be treated like." I brought the note home and showed my parents, and they didn't like it at all. My dad said he was going to start parking on the street so that I could park on the drive for a while, and I thought it would be a good idea. However, if I started doing that, then this person would then know where I lived. My dad agreed, but also worryingly pointed out that he or she may have been watching me and may actually already know where I live. The main thing my father worried about was me walking from my car in the evening when it was dark. I wondered whether to go to the police, but my father said that they would just laugh at us without any proof, so I didn't park on that street anymore. It's now April, and I stopped parking on the drive a few weeks ago. I'm back parking on the street, but a different one close to my house. Nothing has happened since February, and I hope it doesn't happen ever again, as it was starting to get really creepy. Do I have a stalker? Or was it just someone trying to mess with me? This happened in college when I was 18 years old and a sophomore. I had just recently gotten out of a 6-year relationship and was starting to get back into the dating scene. I downloaded Tinder and got to swiping. I didn't want to talk to someone that went to my university, because the thought of running into someone I was talking to online out in the wild really made me anxious. I ended up matching with this guy that we'll call Marco for the sake of this story. Marco was 20 and a junior at the neighbouring university, which was about 15 minutes up the road. He had one selfie, and the other 2 pictures he had were group photos. They seemed older pictures, but I didn't think much of it. So we started chatting, and very quickly he asked for my phone number. I told him I felt it was a little too early for that, but he kept insisting, so I eventually gave in. After about 2 days of talking, he started asking for pictures. So I would send him some selfies, but he would ask for more provocative pictures. But I kept shutting it down, telling him I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted to see where things went. Marco would say how he couldn't wait to meet me so he could kiss me. But every time he would do that, I'd just change the subject as it made me uncomfortable. We planned a date after a week of talking. He said that he knew a good Indian restaurant over by his school. Then we could walk into the downtown area afterwards. I agreed, as it would be in a public place, but then the day came for the date and I started to get a weird feeling. I told my roommate what we had planned, and she said she would keep her phone on her if I needed to call. But a few hours before the date, I got cold feet and told him my car wouldn't start and asked to reschedule. He offered to pick me up, but I kept telling him no. We should just reschedule. He kept insisting and started to make me feel guilty, saying how he'd been looking forward to it for the past few days, how I was hurting his feelings and that he would be more than willing to get me, but I'm not giving him the chance. Well, I caved, and it was the worst decision ever. Despite the feelings I was having, I told him the information to get to the lot outside my dorm. And as soon as I got into the car, I realized that this was probably going to be a horrible date. Right away, he tried to hold my hand and asked to give me a kiss. I denied him, then he started to drive off. On the way to our destination, he dropped that we were no longer going to the restaurant, we're going to his apartment instead, and he was going to cook me dinner. At that point, my heart sunk, and I started to have a small panic attack. I texted my roommate to let her know, and now she was worried, saying she would come and get me if I needed. Again, not listening to my gut, I told her it was fine, and we arrived at his place. Now, when I say that this apartment was disgusting, I mean it was covered in trash, dirty clothes and dirty dishes. He said that we had to go into his room because his roommate was home and he didn't like it when he had company. But his bedroom was even worse than the common area. There was only a single path to the bed and to the bathroom. It was so dirty. We sat on his bed and he put on a movie. I can't remember what movie it was. All I remember is the stench of the room and him starting to make advances towards me. He began rubbing my back and shoulders, and I kept scooting away, trying to put some distance between us, but it didn't work. After a few minutes, he started to force himself on me. He started to kiss me hard and holding my head so that I couldn't move it. I don't know how, but he eventually was on top of me and forcing his entire body weight on me. I couldn't move an inch. I was paralyzed with fear. He didn't get much further than that because as soon as he was on me, he was just as quickly off and running to his restroom throwing up. I have never been so thankful for vomit. I don't know why he got sick, but when he came out he apologized and said, "Happens all the time." Then he said he needed to take me home. Trembling, I got up, straightened myself out and followed him out, still not knowing if he was going to try anything else. I didn't want to aggravate him or say anything wrong, so I tried to act normally, just so I could get home safely. He pulled up to my building and told me that he wanted to make it up to me, so I just nodded and said goodnight and got out of the car. Once inside, I blocked him, reported him on Tinder and deleted the app. I also took extra measures to block him on any social media I could. I didn't tell anyone at first what had happened, as I was embarrassed that I'd put myself in that position. Unfortunately, though, I started getting calls from random numbers, and when I answered, there wouldn't be anyone there. I would block the number and a new one would call, and it got to the point where my phone was ringing constantly. After the phone calls, random Facebook and Instagram messages from different accounts would come in, and they would say things like, "Why are you ignoring me? Why aren't you talking to me?" Then they started getting more aggressive and threatening. Even my roommate began getting messages, and at that point I had to tell her everything. She told me I needed to report him, or at least tell my parents, but I didn't do either, because I was so scared. However, I changed my mind when I started receiving random pictures of myself. I would be walking on campus, in the dining hall, in class. Then I got one of me in my dorm room. It was taken through my window, which was on the second floor, though the main street was a hill that was the same level as my window, and that is what my room faced, and my bed was in front of that window. I told my roommate, and she made me tell our RA, who was very concerned, and ended up calling the campus police. I made a report with them, and in the meantime the messages and photos continued, until one day, about a week later, he approached me on my campus. He grabbed me by the arm and tried to take me to his car, but I started to yell, and luckily there was campus police nearby. He was promptly arrested and banned from my campus, and I thankfully didn't hear from him again. This was quite a few years ago, so some of my memories aren't very vivid, as I've tried to block this part of my past out. Not many people know that this happened to me, and to this day even my family doesn't know. The only people that know are my college roommate, the RA, the campus police, my therapist, and as of the other night, my fiancé. I want to spread awareness of the dangers of online dating. Always trust your gut. If something doesn't seem right, it probably isn't. Not all online dating has consequences. I met my now fiancé a few years later on a different online dating profile. But your gut is usually right, and sometimes it's crucial to listen to it. I've told this story probably over 100 times, and despite being the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, I've come to appreciate that it makes for a great story, so I figured I'd share it with all of you here. I should start by saying that I always hated going camping. My parents sent me to summer camp every year in Colorado, which involved at least one camping trip in the woods. Despite the brevity of these trips, I always resented them. The heavy bag, the lack of toilets, the spiders that always found their way into my tent. When I turned 16 and became a camp counselor in training, however, my distaste for the whole experience briefly changed. At that age, we were only a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given considerable leeway in what we were allowed to do. Most nights we would have to stay in the cabin with our campers, but it was rumoured that the camping trip was a time where the counsellors in training would get drunk, smoke weed and hook up with each other after everyone else went to sleep. What I didn't know, though, was that the events of that camping trip would dissuade me from ever going camping in the woods again. The trip began as any other. Altogether there were around 30 people on the trip. 4 counsellors in training, 4 counsellors, and around 20 or so boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14. Walking in a single file line up and down the various trails, you could hardly hear any sounds of nature over the conversations and laughter of the campers. Several hours went by and we made our way through a dense marshy area and up a steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I wasn't the most athletic kid, so it was around this point that I found myself at the back of the line with one of the other counsellors in training, Jordan, as well as 2 campers who were also struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, and in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers, until the last of them faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up the way. Unconcerned, we kept walking at the same slow pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail started to level off, and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked scorched by a wildfire, and the other half appeared to have been killed by a disease. The eeriness of the landscape was punctuated by a small derelict cabin sitting in the middle of the scorched forest, but seemingly untouched by the fire that must have spread through the area. We were so enraptured by the scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing a bit, but we quickly stopped when we turned to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a long black beard slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes locked on us. He didn't appear to have any hiking supplies on him, and we had no idea how long he had been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally pretty freaked out, but Jordan managed to give the guy a slight wave before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's speed up and get back with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear, and I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. The man muttered again, slightly louder, "Going camping?" Jordan answered the man that yes, we are going camping, to which the man smiled slightly before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Better be careful." We nodded and gave a half-hearted thank you before continuing on to try to find the rest of the group, this time with a much faster pace. Although the man had been walking up the same trail as us when we saw him, he didn't continue, but instead just stood there in the middle of the trail, watching us, as we made our way up the winding path and disappeared from his view. Finally, we managed to catch up to the rest of the group who had been waiting for us, and we told the adult counselors about our interaction with the man. They just shrugged it off, telling us that the guy probably lived in that cabin and just wanted to know what we were doing near his property. Still, I felt unnerved by the encounter, and when we finally arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us. Eventually, though, I put it out of my mind and managed to enjoy myself a bit. Everyone else had gone to bed, and Jordan and the other counselor in training from the boys' cabin had brought 2 warm Mike Harders that they'd stolen from the counselor's quarters, and I took out a joint I had stashed away for this exact occasion. To avoid getting in trouble, we decided to hike out into the woods a bit to smoke the joint, and we made our way to the edge of the river, where we had washed our pots and pans earlier in the day. The spot was eerily silent, and the thought of the man from earlier kept popping into my head. Assuming that I was cold, not anxious, Jordan gave me his blue hoodie, and this prompted one of the other girls to suggest that we switch tents for the night, so I could sleep in the same tent with him, and she could sleep in the same tent as the other boy. I had absolutely no problem with this, and after smoking the joint, we made our way back to our tents, which were pitched slightly away from the others, and we discreetly sipped on the Mike Harders while telling scary camping stories. Some time passed, and one of the boys was in the middle of telling a rather muddled story that he was clearly making up on the spot, when he suddenly stopped. In the silence, we could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away, near one of the other campers' tents. As we strained to listen to what was going on, the noises stopped, and even though we assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to go to the bathroom, being stoned and hopped up from the scary stories, we decided to call it a night and go hide in our tents. Jordan followed suit, and we awkwardly made out before eventually going to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it must have been quite late when I suddenly woke up to the distinct sounds of footsteps walking around near my tent. Shot with adrenaline, I tried to lay as still as possible and quiet my breathing. From the sound, it was apparent that someone was less than 3 feet away from the front of my tent, seemingly pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan, but I was immediately put at ease when I saw that he wasn't next to me. Assuming Jordan was the one I had been hearing, I closed my eyes and I was just beginning to drift back to sleep when I heard the tent unzip. I felt Jordan lie down next to me, and after a few moments he put his arms around me and began to spoon me. After nearly drifting off to sleep again, I realized I had to go to the bathroom and muttered something about having to go pee before beginning to unzip my sleeping bag. Seemingly annoyed by the noise, Jordan lazily turned over, pulling his hoodie up over his head before going still again. Quietly, so as to not wake him, I unzipped the tent and quickly scanned the campsite for any movement. Comforting myself that Jordan had just gone to pee and it was fine, I put my shoes on and began making the trek across our campsite to the designated pee zone. I had just made it to the area and pulled my pants down when I heard rustling coming from the campsite, as if someone was rummaging through our supplies and bags. Still slightly drunk, I tried to pull my pants up, and in my haste I lost my balance and tried to catch myself with a branch that made a loud snapping noise when I grabbed it. I tried to gather myself as quietly as I could, but when I finally managed to look up, I could see that there was a figure making its way across our campsite in my direction. Before I could even think, I was blinded by the bright light of a flashlight shining directly into my eyes, and the light was getting bigger, so whoever it was, they were coming towards me. Frozen and panicked, the figure got 10 feet away from me before I heard Jordan's voice say, "Sorry, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief, but then Jordan asked me something that really confused me. "Have you seen my blue hoodie? I know you gave it back to me, but I think one of the campers might have stolen it from my bag while I was sleeping." After a brief pause, I managed to stutter out, "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." What he said next made my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to see if I had left it by accident. But after I couldn't find it, I thought I'd check the boys' bags, and that's when I saw you." My confusion quickly turned to sheer terror, as I realized that the man who got into the tent with me just moments prior hadn't been Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked me what happened, and I managed to get out that whoever stole his hoodie was sleeping in our tent. Not believing me, Jordan insisted on walking back to the tent to check it out. As slowly and quietly as possible, we made our way to the side of the tent, and when Jordan flipped on his flashlight and shined it through the nylon lining, he let out a high-pitched scream. We could both see the clear outline of a man's shadow lying still inside our tent. What happened next is a bit of a blur, but we ran to the pod of tents on the other side of the campground where the older counselors were sleeping, and frantically unzipped their tent and started yelling for them to come out, and that there was a man in our tent. I remember panic setting in as our counselors slowly and groggily woke up, but after a bit more frantic yelling, they finally managed to understand the severity of the situation when a commotion broke out on the other side of the camp near our tent. By the time they ran to the scene, however, they only found an unzipped tent and a bunch of our things littered on the ground that the man had apparently knocked over or thrown during his escape. After that, we heard the counselors radioing back down to the camp to call the police, and we could tell that they were as scared as we were. I don't think any of us slept after that. Luckily, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to come up, and by that time a few of the other counselors had arrived with guns to escort us back to the camp. On our way back down, one of the campers found Jordan's jacket tied around one of the trees on the path, like some kind of marker. Needless to say, he didn't want the hoodie back, and we just left it there. To this day, I can't say for certain that the man in the tent was the same guy that we'd run into earlier on the trail, but his face and that night still haunt me. It was back in 2018 when I was 17 and living in foster care. The group home was situated on a busy street, but despite living in the city, we had a backyard, basketball court, picnic table, and at the very back some grass. The whole backyard was surrounded by 2-meter-tall chain-link fences, and there were houses to the right and left. At the very back of the yard, on the other side of the fence, there was a public walking and biking path that stretched at least 12 kilometers, and it would take you through this huge park along the water to the beach. It was a very popular area for people to visit. Now, I was a regular cannabis smoker. Although I was always very well put together for a teenager, The group home workers agreed to turn a blind eye on me, as long as I didn't make it obvious. So on weekend mornings, I'd go for a walk to the park behind the house, roll up on a bench and smoke. One day, however, everything changed. It was a weekend as usual at 7 a.m. when I made my way to my favourite park bench. Sitting there with my joint in hand, it was quite windy, and it kept lighting out. Facing the water, there is about 100 metres of field between the waterfront, when I noticed a man stomping through the field heading straight for me. He didn't seem like he was on a leisurely walk at all, and I remember thinking to myself, 1. Why is he not using the path? 2. Why does it seem like he's walking straight towards me? 3. What is he holding? And 4. Is anybody else around? Panic ensued. He was holding something chunky in one hand, and I desperately looked around for someone. I noticed an elderly woman walking from the direction of the group home, and she was about 20 metres away from me. I sped walk towards her, and by the time I got to her, the man had made it to the bench that I'd been sitting on. The woman kept walking towards the bench and I in the opposite direction, and for a moment I looked back to make sure the man wasn't following me, or worse. When I saw the man lay his brick down on a pile of rocks behind the bench, the woman stopped walking, so I guess she had thought the same as me. Thankfully, the man kept moving straight towards the boulevard and not to be seen in the park again. The woman then turned around and looked at me like she was in shock. I remember feeling reassured. Then we both went on our way, without saying a single word to each other. Later the same day at around 9 p.m, people aren't allowed to smoke within 10 metres of an entry to an establishment, and there was only one light in the backyard. It was above the entryway, when this girl in my group home went out for a smoke in the backyard. No lights were on, and about 3 minutes later she was banging on the door and yelling. I let her in and she was freaked out. Trying to get answers out of her, she explained that there was a man who just stood there on the path. She watched and stared, taking pulls off her cigarette, when the man then started walking towards her and climbing the fence. That was when I shared my story from that same morning, and to be honest, I thought I was being paranoid at first. But when someone tried to hop the fence, I believe it was the same man. The workers on shift that night called the police, and the police started patrolling that path at night. The group home added some garden lights in the back too, and I hope this POS never lays hands on anyone. This happened a long time ago, but I've never forgotten it, as it was one of the strangest encounters that my family and I have ever experienced. I was around 12 at the time, so I think I had a good understanding of how to read people, and that was when I went with my family on our monthly trip to the grocery store to stock up, so we were going to be there for a while. We began in the produce aisle, when suddenly a strange man caught my eye. He was standing awkwardly close to us, pretending to browse the vegetables, and his body language just seemed off. He had his back to us, but something seemed strange about the way he was standing. As we slowly made our way down the aisle, picking and choosing what we were going to put in our cart, he would slowly keep rotating himself so his back was always facing us. As we got a little closer, I could see he was wearing some of those gimmick sunglasses that have hidden mirrors on the inside of the lenses so you could see behind. He looked to be in his 40s, had a dirty grey zip-up jacket on, and long dark messy hair. Still shopping, wherever we went, I would see him standing there, staring at me from across the store. He would keep his distance from us, but he was always within eyesight no matter where we were. About 30 minutes in, my mum still hadn't noticed him, but he was starting to really creep me out. I told my mum about him, but she didn't believe me at first. But when we got to the refrigerator aisles, it became very weird. Up until now, whatever aisle we had been in, he would occasionally and quickly pace past us. But at this point, he wasn't even trying to look like he was shopping, and my mum and sister were now starting to notice this, also becoming concerned. Grabbing something off one of the shelves, I could see him standing on the opposite aisle, peering through at us. His sunglasses were on still, but now his hood was up, so we quickened our pace, doing random zigzags to see if he really was following us. He was, so we tried to lose him, but he was keeping up, and all in a very sneaky way at that. He would always be at the opposite end of the aisle, but he kept up with us the whole time. My mum was now really rattled by it, so we pushed our cart up to the customer service area to report it to the store manager. This must have scared him off, because now we couldn't see him anywhere. The manager was very helpful, and she actually went to go find the guy to talk to him. So we waited at the counter until she came back to us with a confused look on her face. She looked at my mother and said, "He said that you're his mum." This really shook us all up. The manager rang us up, then suggested we leave and they will escort the strange man away. However, walking out to the car and staying close to our mother, we were met with a horrifying sight. He was just standing across the parking lot opposite our car, his head tilted and a big grin on his face. We floored it out of there, but we could still see him just standing there watching us leave. The last 48 hours of my life have been nuts. I'm a 25-year-old non-binary person renting a 4-bedroom house, and one of my roommates is my boyfriend. The other is my best friend of 10 years, and we'll call her Tracy. Recently, we've been looking for a new roommate, and because of the way this situation turned out, we have determined that I am no longer allowed to be in charge of looking for roommates, because I'm not judgmental enough, and I'm known to ignore red flags. I will start from the beginning, the house showing. So our new prospective roommate showed up and introduced himself. He definitely seemed strange at first, but I wrote it off as him just being eccentric. The main red flag was that at some point he randomly said something to the effect of, "And I won't bring any meth into your house because I'm not on meth. I hate drugs, and I see them as a scourge on this entire country." I didn't ask, so I was immediately weirded out. But my boyfriend and the roommate who was moving out also met the guy, and they both thought that apart from that he seemed normal enough. He didn't look like a stereotypical meth head. His skin was clear and he was kind of chubby. We thought that maybe he thought I was a meth head because I look a little bit scary. I have green hair, a 1G septum and 6 facial piercings. In addition, my roommate who was moving out turned out to be hiding a cat, which made the house stink as it was peeing everywhere, which I've been told is what meth smells like. The town this guy was moving here from is known for meth and crack, and he seemed to be explicitly trying to get away from it. So I thought that maybe he was afraid of ending up in a situation where he was living with drug addicts, so was trying to suss us out that way. Giving him the benefit of the doubt was my first mistake, though. Both Tracy and I were both wigged out about the entire thing, but were kinda desperate for a roommate, as all the other people responding to my listing were either not great fits or were even sketchier than this guy. So needless to say, we let him move in. The day he came, he brought an old man to help move his stuff, but then proceeded to make him move all the things by himself up the stairs, including a refrigerator, whilst he just sat there and watched. New guy signed the lease and immediately after doing so, informed us that he hadn't introduced himself using his real name. He told us his real name, and he wasn't transgender, so the only reason I can think as to why he initially gave us a fake name is probably so he could avoid having us run a background check. After this, I had to go to work, and during my shift, Tracy sent me a message to say that she thought the new guy was weird. But her responses were vague, and I didn't find out what had happened until I got home. This is what she told me. The new guy had gone to the bar after signing the lease, then came back after being kicked out of the bar. It was before 9 p.m. The bar he'd gone to was a biker joint that is notorious for being rowdy. It's hard to get kicked out there, so you pretty much have to do something heinous or to have been creeping on the women in order to get booted out. Once back and drunk off his ass, he said, "The men in there must have been intimidated by me." Yeah, sounds to me like he was creeping then. Before this, I had told the new guy that our landlord was coming up the next day to fix some things in the house. But when he came home, Tracy reminded him about it, and he became extremely angry, to the point that he was flailing his arms. She thought he was going to start breaking things. Tracy was so uncomfortable that she almost went to wake up my boyfriend in the other room. Eventually he calmed down though. Now there is a beanbag next to my couch, and Tracy was sitting on it with her legs slung over the armrest of the couch. At first the new guy went and sat on the couch, and began to read poetry that he'd written for her for an entire hour and a half, all of which was literally just streams of consciousness about how he wants all junkies to die. Afterwards he started telling her how beautiful she was, over and over, and laid his head down between her legs. She was trying her best to ignore him, but he wouldn't stop asking her if she'd fallen asleep. Every time she moved away, he got closer. Then he started inviting her to his room for a beer. Eventually she just got up and went to her room. It was 11 p.m. This man harassed her for 2 entire hours. I thought that was everything, but then she told me that she'd sent the guy's picture to her mum, who then sent his picture to everyone she knew, because she's from the town he was previously living in. It turned out that he'd been stalking Tracy's aunt for an entire year, and that he'd been banned from the bar she works at because he goes there and threatens to kidnap her. She literally has to be escorted out not only by workers but the customers to her car sometimes. We told our landlord, and luckily our lease hadn't been finalised yet, so he agreed to kick him out. I called my mum to come over, and Tracy called her brother for backup, just in case things went south. But our landlord showed up and essentially told him he needed to leave and didn't let the new guy get a word in. New guy started getting agitated and aggressive, so we called the cops and several officers showed up, telling the guy he had no legal standing as there was no lease. He introduced himself to us with a fake name, and he hadn't even been there for a full 24 hours too, so he had to just get out. The guy had to beg his sister to pick him up, and she was so unwilling to do it that she didn't agree until he offered to pay her $200. It's a 20-minute ride to where he was going. He left most of his stuff on our porch, and when we went into his room it smelled like cigarette smoke, and there was an empty pack on the floor, including not 1 or 2, but 7 empty Dr. Pepper cans, garbage, and crusty socks everywhere. This entire situation had me so stressed out that I didn't even notice that he had also left a pair of pissy shorts in the middle of the house's main hallway, which was also the first thing you see when you walk into the house. They were there for the entire day when he knew the landlord was coming. They were still sitting there when he left. I picked them up with a glove and put them on the porch for him to retrieve. But who knows if or when he will come to get his things, because he came back earlier, touched his stuff like he was going to take it, but then just left. All I have to say is that I am so relieved that we caught on to this before the lease was finalised, because this easily could have turned into a situation where Tracy and I were being sexually assaulted or worse. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories in this episode. Please let me know what your views are, and hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, keep being creepy.